Good morning, students. Second year classes. One comprises of member until Dryden and Pope, who belong to neoclassical age. In the second year syllabus of English, we are going to cover the two prominent ages in English literature, namely pre-Romantic age and the Romantic age. So let us first take into consideration what is pre-Romantic age. I will talk in brief about the pre-Romantic age, the predecessor of the pre-Romantic age, that is the neoclassical age and the age of Johnson as we call it, and what are the important characteristics and the important poets of this particular age. Broadly, we can say the history of a later 18th century poetry is the history of a struggle between old and new and of the gradual triumph of the new. On the one hand, there were writers who followed the general practice of the school of Pope and aimed to produce the kind of verse which Pope had brought to perfection and made popular. If you remember a little, Pope followed the heroic couplet. He was a classical poet. In the works of these men, therefore, we recognize the continuance of what we may here call the Augustan tradition. On the other hand, there was a marked tendency among writers of the rising generation to abandon the practice of the school of Pope, respond to a different range of influences, and seek fresh subjects. In the works of these men, therefore, we may recognize the breaking up of the Augustan traditions. The age of Johnson, as we can say, in respects of its poetry, is obviously an age of transition, innovation and varied experiment. It must, however, be borne in mind that the general movement from old to new was the result of many forces and resolves itself under analysis into a number of different movements, following many lines. At this juncture, the reader should return to the epitome of the chief characteristics of the classical school of poetry. So here, students, we are first going to take into consideration the classical school of poetry, and after that we are going to take into consideration the characteristics of the pre-Romantic age. And when you juxtapose the two together, you will find that there is a remarkable difference between the characteristics of the two ages. So the first characteristic of the classical age was, it was mainly the product of intelligence and was strikingly deficient in emotions and imagination. Secondly, it was almost exclusively a town poetry. Town is in single quotes. Third, it was conspicuously wanting in romantic spirit. Fourth characteristics, it was extremely formal and artificial in style. And the last, it adhered rigorously to the closed couplet. So when we talk about the 5 characteristics of the classical school of poetry, in which we put the two poets, the Dryden and Pope, we clearly understand after reading their poems that their poems catered to the mind rather than to the heart. They did not have any iota of emotion and intelligence and imagination in their poems. Their poems are classified as drawing room poems or as town poems because they hardly talk about nature or about rural background. They are lacking in romantic spirit. They are too formal and artificial in style, and as a result of this, those poems were written in the closed couplet. The heroic couplet was perfected by Alexander Pope. Now, when you study these characteristics of the classical age or the age of Dryden and Pope, and when you take into consideration the characteristics of the pre-Romantic age, which I am going to tell you now, the first characteristic of the pre-Romantic age, as we have come to know, is Emotion, passion, and imagination invaded poetry to the destruction of its dry intellectuality, and the old narrow didactic principles were discarded. So it means that the writers or the poets of the pre-Romantic age had a shift towards itself exclusively with the town. Town again is in single quotes, as I highlighted while discussing the classical poetry, and began to deal with nature and rustic life. See, when we talk about Dryden and Pope as town poets, as drawing room poets, we know that they talk only about the city culture. But pre-Romantic poets shifted towards the villages, they shifted towards the rural, they shifted towards nature. A more important feature in it is the growth of the sense of the picturesque, something beautiful, something appealing, and something wonderful. The third characteristic, the romantic spirit revived, and this revival brought with it great changes in the themes and temper of verse. The fourth characteristic, efforts were now made to break away from the stereotype convention of poetic diction and to substitute for these simplicity of phrase and the language of nature. Obviously, when we read the poets of the two ages, that is the poets of the age of Dryden and Pope and the poets of the pre-Romantic period like Thomas Gray, James Thomson, William Collins, we notice a very dramatic and very drastic change. The poems of Dryden and Pope do not touch our hearts. They have nothing to do with an appeal to our emotions, with an appeal to our imagination, and the kind of words that have been employed are those kinds of words which reflect a lot of intellectualism, which reflect a lot of mental capacity. But when we read the verses of the pre-Romantic age and the poets like Thomas Gray, William Collins, and James Thomson, we are simply moved by the simplicity of their phrases and the language of nature. It is so close to the human heart, it is so close to human understanding that it is easily taken in by the heart, and one can easily connect to the poems of the pre-Romantic age. And the last characteristics of the pre-Romantic age is the supremacy of the closed couplet. It was attacked and the other forms of verse were used in its place. So when students, you can just jot down these characteristics and then you can write them together on a page, and then you can compare and contrast the characteristics. If classical age is the age of intelligence, pre-Romantic age is the age of emotion. If classical age is the age of town poetry, pre-Romantic age is the age of rustic and nature. If classical age is the age of closed couplet, pre-Romantic age is the age of blank verse and more independent verse. So these are the characteristics of the pre-Romantic age. Also, we can say that these lines of reactions are sometimes independent of one another. Sometimes they run together and sometimes they cross. And the resulting complexity is so great that to follow the history of a later 18th century poetry in detail would be impossible within the limits of a brief sketch like this. In the interest of simplicity, we will first deal with the continuance of the Augustan tradition. Then we continue to take into consideration some of the characteristics of the pre-Romantic age. Now, in this particular class, we have just taken up the characteristics of the pre-Romantic age, how it was different from the classical age, and in tomorrow's class we are going to take into consideration the important poets of the pre-Romantic age that has been prescribed in the syllabus. We are going to talk about them in detail, about their age, about their characteristics, and about their important works. So students, this much is for the class today. In tomorrow's class, we are going to take the second topic, that is the important poets of the pre-Romantic age. Thank you.